So when we say 7.5% growth between 2004 and 2010, this is a very strong number, and obviously a slight dip that we saw coming through in around 2008. But the economy seems to be recovering quite extensively.
Yeah, I mean, the core view at Rand Merchant Bank is about 7.5% growth for this year and around the same for next year. I think when one is looking at the prospects for the Mozambican economy, it's difficult to ignore the coal sector. And on that note, you know, Mozambique does boast one of the highest coal reserves in the world. Most analysts put it in at about 23 billion tons, and Mozambique's government is predicting 40 million tons production in the next 5 years, and 100 million tons within the next decade. So I think prospects for the Mozambican economy is definitely good when considering the increased projections for exports of coal and gas, which also coincide.
You think these two sectors are going to drive the economy forward?
Very much so, and I think that combined with strong foreign investment and infrastructure spending definitely bode well for the economy. I think as well it's important to note that optimism about Mozambique's economy is not exclusive to the mining sector. There's also good prospects for things like the banking sector, telecoms, and so forth. So I think it definitely does show that Mozambique's economy is becoming increasingly diversified.
Absolutely. I mean, what kind of jobs, what is the unemployment and job scenario that's playing out right now? We know that there has been a lot of civil unrest, a lot to do with the inflation scenario that is playing out there. And this is really endemic when you look at the overall emerging market space, where we're seeing double-digit inflation growth.
Well, inflation has come down considerably last year, and that was mainly due to base effects, better food security conditions, as well as a strengthening of Mozambique's currency against the US dollar. So I do think we're going to see a lower average inflation rate for this year as well, around 7.5%. On the social side, I think if you have GDP per capita sitting at about $519 in 2011, that's pretty low. So and unemployment's around 21%. So I think the low inflation does keep the social pressures at bay, at least in the short term.
With regards to the coal terminal, we know that is, of course, currently being built and in place in Mozambique. What kind of impact is this going to have on the overall coal space, given the fact that now, even though production increases, we know that there is a way to export the coal out of the country?
Well, I think that's what Mozambique always wanted, to see their final product and export it completely. So there have been quite a few improvements in terms of the building of their railways. They're looking at transporting coal down certain rivers now as well. So I think the one railway was Senna. So that's pretty much at its completion stage, and that should be able to transport quite a bit of coal.
Let's also touch on what we see on the deficit side. Structural twin deficits is what we see, budget deficit coming through, and also a current account deficit. Is this a big risk for
Well,
Mozambique?
we are not overly concerned about the budget deficit or the forecasted widening of it, purely because the projected increase in spending is going to be aimed mostly at much-needed infrastructure project as well as much-needed social safety nets. And we are also going to see quite a significant uptick in the government's revenue from its tax collections, mostly from the mining side. So that bodes well for their budget deficits over the longer term. On the current account side, we are also not overly concerned because FDI inflows into the country remain pretty strong, and as well the strong economic growth prospects for the country means that loans that are currently being borrowed to fund this deficit will be easier to pay off over in going forward.
Let's also touch on donor aid, and Mozambique has largely been reliant on this. We've seen a lot of risk aversion on a global level, and donor aid funding has actually started to be pulled back quite significantly. Has Mozambique experienced this?
Well, strangely enough, donor funding into Mozambique remains quite significant, even though there's budgetary constraints from donor countries. I think donor aid into Mozambique has actually reached its peak, though. I think going forward we're going to see a decline, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because that decline is going to be for two reasons. Firstly, Mozambique is going to see an uptick in its revenue, so that's going to help the country's budget. And secondly, donor countries and Mozambique's government has been making a concerted and deliberate effort in order to reduce the country's dependence on donor aid. However, donors do have certain concerns with the country, things like governance issues and the slow pace in reduction of poverty as well as corruption. So those are things that Mozambique does need to tend to.
You mentioned FDIs, foreign direct investment. What kind of level are you expecting into this year? And we know a lot of the economies in Africa are fighting for a specific pool of money. Is Mozambique a favoured area right now?
Yeah, I mean, Mozambique's always been favoured in terms of FDI as well because of its resources and in terms of donate as well. We are predicting FDI at around the 7.5% of GDP level for this year. And I think the important thing to note is that those flows are of the longer term nature. So I don't think we're going to see a heavy outflow of money if the global economy
Where do we see a lot of interest from? Is it, again, still the Chinese?
I think definitely it's the Chinese and the Brazilian companies as well when it comes to the coal side.
Okay, so with regards to some of the biggest challenges in your mind, I mean, you mentioned unemployment sitting at 21%. Very good to note that CPI has now dropped to around 7.5%. What other challenges do you foresee going forward?
I think on the operational side, Mozambique does have certain challenges. It sits at about 139 out of 183 countries on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report, which is quite a negative number. I think the biggest contributor to that is the corruption side. The country fares pretty badly on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index at about 2.7. So those are the two biggest issues on the operational side. I think, as well as you mentioned, the social side is still a challenge for the country. As I mentioned, GDP per capita is pretty low, so and unemployment sits at about 21%. So I think definitely there needs to be an improvement in the standard of living within the country for those challenges to be addressed.
With regards to the export market, when it comes to coal, we know it's still viewed as a very dirty element, but it is a sector that is ensuring that we electrify a lot of the African countries. So just give us your perception on this.
Well, I think in order for the coal sector to be a driving factor in the Mozambican economy, we definitely need more certainty on the global economy and on China, and that's something that's not known to anybody at the moment. So I think we sort of take a more cautious approach when estimating exports of coal or any commodities for that matter out of any of our African countries.